The whole of this sign, the whole of this is a sign that ethics and morals are deeply embedded in their brains. Consequently, the fine spiritual perception of right or wrong is always present in them, and they are always able to rightly recognize and to perceive, comprehend, and logically follow reality, and thus realness and its truth. Therefore, they always take the right decisions and are able to act rightly. The creation energy, together with the personality and the consciousness, is the most important factor in that the creationally given energy and power gives life to the human being, namely in such a wise that it animates the personality and thus also the consciousness. It is also through this energy and power that the human beings are able to create thoughts and feelings by means of their consciousnesses, through which they cannot only mold, form, and use their daily lives, but also learn and acquire knowledge through which they in turn evolve. That is to say, develop and become more knowing, more understanding, more knowledgeable, more capable, and more lettered, and so forth. This creates an ongoing evolutive impression and an understanding of reality and its truth, which fundamentally uplifts the consciousness, its thoughts, and the feelings, as well as forms the state of the psyche to a high value, and therefore creates morals of ethical norms and thus of fundamentals of moral values that regulate general interhuman behavior, which is normally recognized and accepted as binding by many human beings, as well as being perceived in a fine spiritual wise as the individual's moral fine spiritual perception. Fundamentally, it is to be understood that all activity of the consciousness is always a product of the creation energy and offers the human being the possibility to keep life functioning and to evolve knowingly through its energy and power. Everything conceivably possible in both positive and negative form of the thoughts and feelings is based solely on the fact that the creation energy alone offers everything in terms of energy and power, so that human beings are able to also bring about feeling impulsations by means of the thinking. However, how they form their thoughts and feelings in a positive or negative wise, and whether they are connected to reality and its truth, or to unreality and thus to untruth, is something they decide for themselves. If they decide to think realistically by themselves and to bring forth and logically follow real positive feelings from this, then they are human beings who see reality as it actually is. Consequently, they continuously strive to assess, decide, and act accordingly to reality and its truth. If, however, human beings are undecisive, careless, slovenly, and lacking in energy in the sense of unconcernedness, or if they are too young to perceive, comprehend, and logically follow reality and its truth, then they begin very early, as a rule through indoctrination in the form of upbringing and hearsay, as well as copying from acquaintances and the environment and so forth, to shield themselves from reality. As a result, they turn to what they simply want to believe and accept as truth, thus simply trusting and without thinking rely on all that is said. Anything opposite that is based on reality and its truth is unconsiderately rejected and deemed to be a lie and deception. However, in return, the realization of an expectation is hoped for, which, however, remains unfulfillable at all times. This is because the hope in this regard is only based on a presented, illusional, audacious lie machination, and an evil cheating, which is fundamentally based on a deceptive imagination and illusion, which entails a delusion and unfulfillable expectations. Therethrough, human beings come to the point that they become believers with regard to the lies and cheatings that ingratiatingly present something that does not exist and that prevent their self-thinking and self-decision making in any case from scrutinizing everything in depth and finding the reality in its truth, because they simply fall prey to a belief and no longer know how to make themselves free from it. This happens equally with every religious belief that is indoctrinatingly hammered into the majority of children from their earliest youth, often from birth, and thus the human being growing up in is propelled into a belief-based dependence and into a corresponding religious belief-based behavior. In the case of religion, it can be any one of them, because for the belief itself, it makes no difference, because each one gets very badly out of control of the good human nature in a very short time to become a tremendous addiction, which young human beings are not able to control, and with which they then grow up and go through their lives. Every religious belief leads to a dependence, almost a pathological craving, with almost no hope of rescue, as a result of which human beings befallen by it feel a strong desire to embed their addictive beliefs and their addictive behavior ever more deeply in themselves, wherethrough they, in this respect, lose control over their independent thinking to such an extent that they believe in any situation that the God in whom they believe will surely direct everything in accordance with the rightness. This negative consequence of their belief addiction does not let them forego it anymore. Consequently, there are never any withdrawal symptoms, just as no doubts or considerations regarding the addictions occur when they are confronted with it. However, if this does happen, then withdrawal symptoms immediately appear, which as a rule lead to the immediate breaking off of acquaintances and friendships and so forth with those human beings who dared to questioningly or explanatorily raise their voices with regard to the belief addiction. This, as a rule, is the reason why duties are simply neglected by the believers and, as already mentioned, acquaintances, friendships, or close relationships are simply brought to an end without a whimper. Pathological craving for religious or worldly belief, as a rule, develops sneakingly in the growing up human being, therefore not in the same form as a grown-up human being who, through some experience and so forth, acquires a delusional belief in God from one moment to the next, or in some other wise in a short time. In a child, belief occurs sneakily through several stages in continuous motion that result from the development of increasing age, in which case the addictive substance of belief is used more and more to avoid problems, in which case the control over one's own responsibility with regard to ethics and morals is also lost. And what has been lost is replaced more and more by bad habits. Thereby, the pathological craving for belief only turns to such an extent that a hidden or open hatred arises against all fellow human beings who are not of exactly the same belief or are without it. I think we'll take a pause there. So any comments or? The belief addiction is not based on any genetic predisposition. but solely and exclusively on indoctrinating influences and the inconsiderate belief-based copying of the same by the human being in question. In a religiously believing family, a child at a very young age already finds itself in a difficult religiously believing starting position, which constitutes a risk factor for the child to be able to develop its thought world autonomously without being harmed, because the religious belief that is shown to it by the family members has a dangerously indoctrinating effect, which the child cannot make a stand against or can do so only with great difficulty. Depending on the family conflicts, stress and Gewalt, and even misuse in childhood or in the time of youth, a religious belief comes about that does not allow any viable ethic moral self-development. Rather, it all the more destroys any personal ethical moral impulse control and the sense of social development from the ground up. This also damages the capacities for the upbuilding of all important protective factors with regard to health, as a result of which the growing up human being inevitably has to make do with inadequate use of immune-based powers of resistance in his or her later adulthood. The whole of Gewalt, strife, as well as many other ethical moral unrightnesses, which also originate from the environment of the society and which have a negative effect on the general cultural milieu, contribute greatly to the belief delusion, which has not only a religious but also a worldly effect. The socially inadequate norms of ethics and morals, which as such are obviously unknown to the science of psychology in their entire scope, but as a whole form the ample values by which the human beings become a true human being when he or she learns, masters, and uses them in the daily life, are the great terrible thing of the fact that the human being as a thinking basin thinks, decides, and acts against that which is right, neutral, and life affirming. As a result, everything is laid out for fighting, for malicious punishment, for murder and manslaughter, in which case the human being thinks, sees, assumes, and advocates this for as good and fair. This also occurs in jurisdiction, and indeed simply because the death penalty is applied, as well as covert or overt torture, inquisitions, insults and persecution, and unfair sentences. There is also the factor of the execution of the sentence, which frequently goes hand in hand with torment, harassment, and other bad and inhumane methods. But fighting is also waged politically and indeed with legal, coercive measures through which the human being's freedom is curtailed or robbed, as well as with military, through which state hostilities are fraught with war, with orders to kill and murder, which not only bring mass deaths and suffering, hardship and misery, but also tremendous destruction of valuable human achievements. However, that is not all, because also suffering and hardship, as well as Ausartung, lies, and serious financial and other types of cheating, murder and manslaughter and so forth through various kinds of sports are ethically, morally unworthy to such an extent that it can be called more than just gruesome. This is because these sports are not only directed toward fighting and victory, which not only leads to strife and Gewalt, but also to hatred, to revenge and persecution, and even to murder and manslaughter. There is also a desire for might connected with it, and everyone wants to be bigger and better than the human being next to oneself, And this again provides a reason for harming, neglecting, and ultimately hating one's fellow human being, and so forth. As a result, psychoactivity develops in human beings that takes hold of their entire pseudo-thinking and influences it in such a wise that their brains set in motion complex chemical processes of around 90,000 million nerve cells, which further produce chemical messengers, and these in turn trigger thoughts and bring forth attitudes that demand gratification, just as the addiction of belief requires. This process can no longer be simply shut off because it is very difficult to control once it has come about, which is why it is necessary to pay attention right from the beginning to avoid the upcoming of this addictive state of a belief. This, however, is only possible if human beings maintain a clear sense and never, ever give themselves over to any cause in a belief-based wise, and thus do not fall prey to the belief addiction. This works without exception in such a wise that only a pseudo-thinking is possible, which is founded in the human beings not being able to think according to reality and its truth, but only appearing to do so, which they do not perceive, however, because their pseudo-thoughts are not neutral, but are influenced in every case by that which dominates them through the belief addiction. The problem of not learning about ethics and morals, which as a rule are also not practiced in a fully ample wise and only in an inadequate form, because they are unknowingly psychologically recommended, therethrough only certain modes of behavior are supposed to be adhered to in order to be socially useful, has the consequence that the non-mastery of them effectively, amply manifests itself. In fact, human beings become addicted not only to their beliefs, but also to the inadequate ethical and moral behavior that results from it. And this happens because the belief addiction neglects all the activities and obligations of reality and its truth, which harms not only human beings themselves, but the entire social environment. Yet human beings who have fallen prey to the belief addiction do not perceive this, for which the reasons are very manifold, most of which can be found in the processes of the brain, because as it is with the substance-related addiction, also the behavior stimulates the limbic system and reacts accordingly.